Dr. Margaret held her hand. She opened her eyes and spoke for the first time in 3 years. Just 7 words. The moment the doctor heard those words, he started trembling. The nurse ran from the room, and 20 minutes later, the FBI was at the door. Because those 7 words were the key to a secret that had been sought for 45 years. Welcome to True Heroic Stories, where the most incredible tales of courage and truth are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Riverside Care Home in Burlington, Vermont. It was March 15th, 2024, and the facility hummed with its usual quiet routine. Breakfast trays clinked softly down the hallways, medication carts rolled between rooms, and the soft murmur of daytime television drifted from the common areas. In room 147, Eleanor Walsh sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring out the window at nothing particular. At 82, she had once been a vibrant woman, a teacher, a mother, a pillar of her community. But Alzheimer's had stolen all of that away, piece by piece, memory by memory. Dr. Margaret Chen had been Eleanor's primary physician for the past 4 years, ever since the diagnosis became undeniable. She'd watched this brilliant woman, who once taught high school chemistry and could recite the periodic table backwards, slowly disappear into silence. "Good morning, Eleanor," Dr. Chen said softly, entering the room with her usual gentle demeanor. She'd said these same words every morning for 1,247 days. Eleanor had not responded once. Eleanor's son, David Walsh, sat in the corner chair, the same chair he'd occupied every Tuesday and Friday for 3 years. He was a man in his 50s, graying at the temples, wearing the kind of tired expression that comes from watching your parents slip away day by day. "Any changes?" Dr. Chen asked, though she already knew the answer. David shook his head. "Same as always. She ate a little breakfast, but—" He trailed off, the futility of hope weighing heavy in his voice. Dr. Chen nodded and began her routine examination. Blood pressure, pulse, reflexes, all normal for someone in Eleanor's condition. The disease had progressed exactly as expected, cognition gone, communication lost, but the body stubbornly continuing. What Dr. Chen didn't know, what no one could have known, was that behind Eleanor's vacant stare, something was stirring. Not memory exactly, but something deeper. Something that had been buried for nearly half a century, waiting. Eleanor's mind was like an old house with most of the lights turned off. Room after room sat in darkness. Her teaching career, her late husband's face, her son's childhood. But in the deepest basement of her consciousness, one small flame still flickered. It was a memory from 1979. She was 37 then, working late in her chemistry lab at Burlington High School. The building was empty, or so she thought, when she heard voices coming from the administrative offices upstairs. She'd gone to investigate, thinking perhaps a janitor had left a radio on. But as she climbed the stairs, the voices became clearer. 2 men, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "The shipment comes through Thursday night," one voice had said. "Container 847, Port of Boston. Peterson will handle the transfer." "What about the school?" the second voice asked. "Perfect cover. No one suspects a chemistry teacher. The lab equipment explains everything." Eleanor had frozen on the stairs, her hand gripping the banister. She recognized the second voice immediately. Principal Harrison Blackwood, the man who'd hired her, who'd been a mentor and friend. "The product goes straight to the warehouse in Montpelier," Blackwood continued. "From there, Chicago, Detroit, all the major cities. We're talking millions, Jack." Eleanor had crept back down the stairs, her heart pounding. She'd gathered her things and left immediately, her mind reeling with what she'd heard. But who could she tell? Who would believe that the respected principal was involved in— what exactly? Drugs? Weapons? She'd tried to forget it, tried to convince herself she'd misunderstood. But 3 days later, a DEA agent was found dead in Boston Harbor, and Eleanor knew she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a school chemistry experiment. She'd kept the secret for 45 years, buried it so deep that even when Alzheimer's began stealing her memories, this one remained, too important, too dangerous to let go. Dr. Chen was checking Eleanor's pupils with a small flashlight when it happened. Eleanor's hand, which had been limp for years, suddenly gripped the doctor's wrist with surprising strength. Dr. Chen looked down, startled. Eleanor's eyes, usually unfocused and distant, were now locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed to cut through years of fog. "Eleanor?" Dr. Chen whispered. David's head snapped up from his magazine. "What's happening?" Eleanor's lips moved slightly, as if she was trying to remember how to form words. Her grip on Dr. Chen's wrist tightened. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but clear as crystal, Eleanor spoke her first words in 3 years. "Harrison Blackwood killed Agent Morrison." The flashlight slipped from Dr. Chen's trembling hand. David shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What did she say?" David asked, his voice tight with confusion and hope. Dr. Chen stared at Eleanor, whose eyes were now streaming with tears, the first emotion she'd shown in years. "Eleanor, what did you just say?" Dr. Chen asked gently. But Eleanor's eyes were already growing distant again, the moment of clarity fading like smoke. Her hand released the doctor's wrist and fell back to her lap. Dr. Chen's mind was racing. Harrison Blackwood, she knew that name. Every longtime resident of Burlington knew it. He'd been the beloved principal of Burlington High for over 30 years before retiring in the early 1980s. He died in 1997, honored and respected. But Agent Morrison, Dr. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered reading about it in old newspaper archives while researching local history for a community project. DEA agent James Morrison had been found dead in Boston Harbor in November 1979. The case had never been solved. "David," Dr. Chen said quietly, "I need you to call the police." "What? Why?" "Just trust me. Ask for Detective Sarah Martinez. Tell her Dr. Weil Chen needs to speak with her about the Morrison case. She'll know what you mean." Detective Sarah Martinez had been with the Vermont State Police for 15 years, specializing in cold cases. The Morrison file sat in a box in the basement of the Burlington Police Department, one of dozens of unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s. She'd actually pulled the file 3 months earlier, part of a new initiative to review old cases with modern technology. Agent James Morrison, 34, found floating in Boston Harbor with a bullet in his head. He'd been working undercover on a drug trafficking operation that stretched from Boston to Montreal. The trail had gone cold decades ago, but Sarah had always suspected the case was bigger than anyone realized. Morrison hadn't been some street-level investigation. He'd been tracking a major operation, something sophisticated enough to use legitimate businesses as cover. When she received David's call, her blood ran cold. She drove to Riverside Care Home with 2 other detectives, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. In room 147, Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, once again staring vacantly out the window, but Dr. Chen was waiting with a recording device. "She spoke once more, about 20 minutes after I called you," Dr. Chen explained. "I managed to record it." Sarah listened to the crackling audio. The school, chemistry lab, shipping container 847, Peterson handled the transfer, warehouse in Montpelier. The words were fragmented, delivered in Eleanor's weak voice with long pauses between each phrase, but to Sarah they were pure gold. "Container 847, she murmured to her partner, Detective Mike Torres. "Boston Harbor, 1979. "You think she witnessed something?" Torres asked. Sarah nodded. "I think she's been carrying this for 45 years. She turned to David, who sat stunned in his corner chair. "Mr. Walsh, did your mother ever mention Harrison Blackwood?" David frowned. "The old principal? She taught at Burlington High for years. Of course she knew him. Did she ever say anything unusual about him? Anything that seemed off?" David shook his head slowly. "She always spoke highly of him. But," he paused, thinking, "there was something. After she retired, whenever someone mentioned his name, she'd get this look, almost like she was afraid." Sarah exchanged glances with Torres. "Mr. Walsh, we're going to need to dig into your mother's past, her employment records, anything she might have kept from her teaching days." "Detective," Dr. Chen interrupted, "there's something else. Eleanor worked late, often during the late 1970s. She was known for staying after hours to prepare experiments for the next day's classes." The pieces were starting to fall into place in Sarah's mind. A chemistry teacher working late, overhearing conversations, witnessing something she wasn't supposed to see. Sarah's team worked through the night, pulling files that hadn't been opened in decades. The Morrison case file was thick. The FBI had thrown considerable resources at the investigation before it went cold. Agent Morrison had been tracking a drug trafficking operation that was using legitimate businesses to move product up the East Coast. The drugs came through Boston Harbor in shipping containers, then moved inland through a network of warehouses and distribution points. "Look at this," Torres said, pointing to a list in the file. Container 847 was flagged by customs 3 days before Morrison's death. But when they opened it, all they found was laboratory equipment bound for various schools in Vermont. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Schools, chemistry equipment. She grabbed another file, the Burlington Police Department's records from 1979. There it was, a report filed by a concerned citizen about suspicious late-night deliveries to Burlington High School. The complainant had reported seeing trucks unloading equipment after hours. The investigating officer had spoken with Principal Harrison Blackwood, who explained that they were receiving new chemistry equipment for the upcoming semester. The officer had noted that Blackwood was cooperative and that everything seemed legitimate. "Jesus," Sarah whispered. They were using the school as a front. Torres leaned over her shoulder. The perfect cover. Who's going to question chemistry equipment going to a high school? Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from the state police lab. They'd been working on some evidence from the Morrison case that had never been fully processed due to limited technology in 1979. "DNA results are in," she told Torres. They found foreign DNA on Morrison's clothing. They drove to the lab in Waterbury, where forensic specialist Dr. Lisa Park was waiting with a file. "The DNA is male," Dr. Park explained. "We ran it through CODIS, but no matches. However, I did find something interesting in the Burlington High School records." She handed Sarah a personnel file. Harrison Blackwood had minor surgery in 1981. The hospital kept tissue samples. Sarah's eyes widened. "Can you run a comparison?" "Already did. It's a match." The room fell silent. After 45 years, they had physical evidence linking Harrison Blackwood to James Morrison's murder. Sarah returned to Riverside Care Home the next morning, this time with FBI agent Rebecca Stone. The federal agent was tall, serious, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Eleanor was in the same position as before, but when Agent Stone entered the room, something remarkable happened. Eleanor's head turned slightly, and her eyes focused with that same startling clarity. "Eleanor," Agent Stone said gently, "I'm Agent Stone with the FBI. I believe you have information about Agent Morrison." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. "Can you tell us what you saw?" For a moment, Eleanor was silent. Then, in fragments, the story came out. "Thursday night, November. I stayed late, heard voices upstairs, Harrison and another man talking about the shipment." She paused, breathing heavily from the effort of speaking. "Container 847, they were using my lab, storing drugs, when they found out Morrison was close." Another pause, this one longer. "Harrison said they had to silence him. I heard him make the call." Agent Stone leaned forward. "Eleanor, this is very important. Did you see Harrison kill Agent Morrison?" Eleanor shook her head weakly. "No, but I heard him order it." Dr. Chen, who had been taking notes, looked up. "There's more. Yesterday, when you were gone, she said something else." She played another recording. "Peterson, Jack Peterson, he did the actual killing. Harrison paid him $50,000. Agent Stone's eyes widened. "Jack Peterson. We've been trying to connect him to this case for decades." She turned to Sarah. "Peterson was a known enforcer for the Boston mob. He died in a prison fight in 1995, but we never had evidence linking him to Morrison." Eleanor's voice came again, barely a whisper. "The warehouse, Montpelier, Building 7, that's where they kept the records." Building 7 in the industrial district of Montpelier had been abandoned for 20 years. The roof leaked, windows were broken, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. But in 1979, it had been the Blackwood Storage Company, owned, according to county records, by Harrison Blackwood himself. Sarah's team arrived with search warrants and excavation equipment. If Eleanor was right, somewhere in this crumbling building were the records of one of the largest drug trafficking operations in Vermont's history. They found them in a hidden room behind a false wall in the office area. boxes and boxes of documents perfectly preserved in the dry basement air. Shipping manifests showing containers from South America arriving in Boston. Transfer records showing the movement of chemistry equipment to schools throughout New England. Financial records showing millions of dollars in transactions. And in a locked file cabinet, a folder labeled Morrison Problem. Inside were photographs of Agent Morrison, copies of his reports, and detailed plans to eliminate him. The final document was a payment voucher for $50,000, signed by Harrison Blackwood, with a note, JP, Boston job complete. Agent Stone held up the paper, her hands trembling slightly. This is it. This is the smoking gun we've needed for 45 years. But there was more. The financial records showed that the operation hadn't ended with Morrison's death. It had continued for another 3 years, ultimately moving over $50 million worth of drugs through New England schools. My God, Sarah whispered. How many other teachers knew? How many other people were involved? Agent Stone was already on her phone, calling Washington. We're going to need a full task force, she said. This is bigger than we thought. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. 45-year-old murder solved by Alzheimer's patient's final words, read the headline in the Burlington Free Press. By evening, it was national news. Eleanor Walsh, the chemistry teacher who had carried a deadly secret for nearly half a century, had finally found her voice just in time to deliver justice. At Riverside Care Home, Eleanor's room was filled with flowers from strangers. Cards poured in from across the country, from other teachers, from law enforcement officers, from Morrison's family. Agent Stone visited her every day for a week, gently coaxing out more details while Eleanor's clarity lasted. Slowly, the full scope of the operation became clear. Harrison Blackwood hadn't just been a corrupt principal. He'd been the mastermind of a network that used schools across New England as fronts for drug trafficking. Chemistry teachers, janitors, even some administrators had been involved, often unknowingly. The investigation expanded to include other schools, other cases. 3 more cold case murders were solved. Dozens of arrests were made. But as the media attention swirled around her, Eleanor began to fade again. The effort of speaking, of remembering, seemed to exhaust whatever reserves she had left. Dr. Chen found her on a Thursday morning, peacefully asleep in her wheelchair. She never woke up. Eleanor Walsh's funeral was attended by hundreds of people she'd never met. FBI agents, police officers, prosecutors, and families of other victims whose cases had been solved because of her courage. Agent Stone delivered the eulogy. Eleanor Walsh lived with a terrible burden for 45 years. She could have taken this secret to her grave. Indeed, it seemed she would. But even as Alzheimer's stole almost everything else from her, it couldn't steal her sense of justice. In her final moments of clarity, she chose to speak. She chose to remember. She chose to ensure that the truth would finally be told. David Walsh stood beside her grave long after the crowd had dispersed. In his hand, he held a letter that had arrived that morning from the families of Agent Morrison and 2 other victims. Your mother was the bravest person we never knew, it read. She carried the weight of justice for all of us, and she never gave up. Because of her, our loved ones can finally rest in peace. 6 months later, the Eleanor Walsh Memorial Fund was established to provide resources for cold case investigations across New England. The fund's motto, printed on every document, every press release, truth never forgets. Today, room 147 at Riverside Care Home houses a different patient, but a small plaque beside the door reads, "In memory of Eleanor Walsh, teacher, truth-teller, hero." The case led to sweeping reforms in how law enforcement handles witness protection and cold case investigations. The Walsh Protocol now ensures that potential witnesses in major cases receive ongoing protection and support. More importantly, Eleanor's story sparked a movement. Across the country, people began coming forward with information about old cases, secrets they'd carried for decades. Tips poured into police departments from coast to coast. She showed us that it's never too late to speak up, Agent Stone told reporters. Even when everything else fades away, justice remains, truth remains. Dr. Chen kept the recording of Eleanor's final words. Sometimes, late at night in her office, she plays it back. Harrison Blackwood killed Agent Morrison. 7 simple words. 7 words that had waited 45 years to be spoken. 7 words that changed everything. In our darkest moments, truth still finds a way. Often in the quietest voices, sometimes in the final breath, but always when it matters most. Eleanor Walsh proved that some secrets are too important to die with us, and some truths are too powerful to stay buried forever. You may forget the details, but remember this: every voice matters, every truth counts, and it's never too late to speak up for justice. Subscribe to True Heroic Stories, where courage lives in the most unexpected places, and no act of truth-telling is ever forgotten.